Meet Zariah, my brilliant housekeeper. Julian Croft's voice cuts through the St. Regis Ballroom in New York, a venomous slight against his black wife, Zariah Vance. Before elite shareholders, the white tycoon's words strip her of her legacy as Aura Design's visionary architect. Claudia Wentworth's lips curl in disdain. Edward Langston's brow creases, yet he remains silent. Zariah's fingers tighten on her silk shawl, the fabric twisting as her eyes blaze with unspoken fury. She strides out, chandeliers casting her shadow like a vow of vengeance. What betrayal forged this public wound? Will Zariah dismantle Julian's empire? Listeners are invited to subscribe, share their city and time, and ponder her next move. Can she reclaim her stolen dreams? The saga of truth and retribution beckons, each chapter poised to seize the heart. What fate awaits Julian's arrogance? The St. Regis Ballroom pulsed with the clink of crystal and the hum of calculated laughter. Its gilded walls aglow under chandeliers that scattered light like fractured dreams. Zariah Vance's heels clicked sharply against the marble floor as she strode from the gala. Julian Croft's mocking words, "Meet Zariah, my brilliant housekeeper," still searing her ears. Her silk shawl, twisted taut in her fists, trailed behind like a battle flag. The air outside the ballroom was cooler, sharper, but it did nothing to quell the fire in her chest. She paused in the shadowed corridor, her breath catching, her dark eyes glinting with a resolve that could carve stone. The weight of 1,000 eyes, shareholders, tycoons, sycophants, pressed against her back, their whispers a venomous chorus. Yet it was Julian's smug grin, that calculated betrayal, that cut deepest. Inside, the gala churned on. Julian, resplendent in a Tom Ford tuxedo, raised a fresh champagne flute, his blonde hair catching the light like a crown. "To Aura Designs," he toasted, his voice smooth as polished marble, "and to the vision that will redefine New York's skyline." The crowd erupted in applause, glasses gleaming in a sea of tailored suits and glittering gowns. Claudia Wentworth, her silver hair coiled like a queen's, clapped with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She leaned toward a fellow shareholder, her voice a low hiss. "Zariah Vance, an architect, reduced to a maid? Croft's playing a dangerous game." Edward Langston, his weathered face etched with unease, shifted in his seat, his silence louder than the room's din. He'd known Zariah's brilliance, seen her sketches years ago, raw, soulful designs that had swayed him to invest. Now he wondered what game Julian played. Zariah lingered in the corridor, her back pressed against a velvet-draped wall. Her fingers traced the edge of her shawl, the fabric a tether to the woman she'd been before this night. Before Julian had stripped her of her title, her legacy, her truth. She was no housekeeper. She was the architect who'd breathed life into Aura Designs, whose organic architecture philosophy had birthed their empire. 10 years ago, in a Brooklyn studio reeking of cheap coffee, she'd sketched the first curves of what would become the Solstice Tower, her pencil dancing to the rhythm of waves she'd seen in Big Sur. Julian had been her partner then, his ambition a spark to her flame. Now he stood on her dreams, claiming them as his own. A waiter passed, offering a tray of canapes. Zariah waved him off, her gaze fixed on a distant point. The memory of Julian's hand on her shoulder, patronizing and heavy, replayed like a wound reopened. She could still hear Claudia's whisper, caught as she'd left. "Architect turned housekeeper? What a waste." The scorn had stung, but it was the pity in Edward's eyes that burned worse. They knew, some of them at least. They'd seen her blueprints, heard her speak of buildings as living things, rooted in the earth. Yet none had spoken up. Not one had challenged Julian's lie. She straightened, smoothing her black silk dress, its elegance a quiet defiance. The corridor led to a balcony overlooking the city, and she stepped out, the night air sharp against her skin. New York's skyline glittered below, a jagged crown of ambition and betrayal. Somewhere out there, the Solstice Tower was rising, its steel bones shaped by her vision, stolen by Julian's greed. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she was back in Big Sur, the cobalt sea glass in her hand, its edges smoothed by decades of tides. "This is our cornerstone," she told Julian, her voice alight with hope. He'd kissed her then, promising eternity. Now that glass lay discarded, like her. Inside, Julian worked the room, his laughter a blade disguised as charm. He clapped Edward Langston on the shoulder, ignoring the older man's stiff nod. "The Solstice Tower will be my legacy," Julian declared to a cluster of investors, his eyes gleaming. "A monument to vision." Claudia arched a brow, her fingers tapping her clutch. "Your vision, Julian? Or someone else's?" Her tone was velvet over steel, and a few heads turned. Julian's smile faltered, but he recovered, steering the conversation to profits. Claudia's gaze lingered, sharp as a scalpel. She'd invested in Aura Designs because of Zariah's passion, not Julian's bravado. Something was rotting at the core of this empire. Zariah's hands gripped the balcony railing, her knuckles taut against her dark skin. The city's pulse thrummed below, a challenge and a promise. She wasn't invisible, not yet. The Solstice Tower, her creation, would be her weapon. She thought of her sketchbooks, tucked away in her studio, pages filled with the truth Julian couldn't erase. She thought of Mr. Harrington, the investor who'd believed in her first, his kind eyes and firm handshake. She thought of the video she'd begun to plan, a blade of truth to cut through Julian's lies. As the city lights flickered, Zariah's lips curved, not in a smile but in something fiercer. Julian had mistaken her silence for surrender. He'd forgotten the woman who'd built his empire from pencil and paper, from dreams and grit. She turned back toward the ballroom, her shadow long and unyielding. This was no end, but a beginning. The gala's glow faded behind her, and with each step, Zariah Vance forged a vow. She would reclaim her legacy, brick by brick, truth by truth. Zariah Vance stood on the balcony, the New York skyline a jagged constellation below, its lights pulsing like a heartbeat she no longer trusted. The echo of Julian's betrayal, "my brilliant housekeeper," lingered, a wound that throbbed with every breath. Her fingers, still clutching the silk shawl, loosened as her gaze drifted to the horizon, where the half-built Solstice Tower pierced the night. 10 years ago, that dream had been hers, born in a moment of salt and sunlight. She closed her eyes and the city dissolved into memory, pulling her back to a time when love and ambition were one. Brooklyn 10 years prior, a cramped studio apartment smelling of burnt coffee and turpentine. Zariah, 25, sat cross-legged on a threadbare rug, her sketchbook open to a page of swirling lines. Curves inspired by ocean tides, buildings that breathed like living things. Her dark curls fell over her shoulders, catching the glow of a single lamp. Julian, lean and restless, paced the room, his blue eyes alight with hunger. "We're close, Zariah," he said, his voice a spark. "One investor, and we'll change the game." She looked up, her pencil pausing. "I'm scared, Julian. What if they don't see it? What if my designs aren't enough?" He knelt beside her, his hand warm on hers. "We'll make history together. Your vision, my hustle. Unstoppable." She believed him. His promises were her anchor, his ambition the wind in her sails. Days later, they drove to Big Sur, California, seeking inspiration. The cliffs loomed, rugged and eternal, the Pacific crashing below in a symphony of foam. Zariah wandered the shore, her bare feet sinking into cold sand. She bent down, her fingers brushing a cobalt blue shard of sea glass, its edges smoothed by decades of waves. It glowed in her palm, a fragment of time made beautiful by pressure. "This," she said, holding it to Julian, "this is our cornerstone. Our empire starts here." He took it, his fingers brushing hers, and kissed her fiercely. "Forever," he whispered, slipping the glass into his pocket. "We'll keep it on my desk always." Back in Brooklyn, they poured everything into Aura Designs. Zariah's sketches became blueprints, her philosophy of organic architecture, structures that harmonize with nature, taking shape on paper. Julian worked the phones, charming investors, but it was Zariah's passion that sealed their first triumph. Mr. Harrington, a silver-haired investor with a penchant for risk, visited their studio. His eyes, sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, lingered on Zariah's drawings. "These aren't just buildings," he said, his voice gruff but warm. "They're alive. You've got something rare, Miss Vance." He handed her a leather-bound sketchbook, embossed with her initials. For your next masterpiece, he said. Zariah's heart swelled. Julian squeezed her hand, his grin wide but tinged with something sharper. Pride, or perhaps possession. That night, Zariah turned down a job offer from a prestigious Manhattan firm. The recruiter's voice had been smooth, promising a corner office. But she'd chosen Julian, chosen their dream. We're building something bigger, she told him, her eyes bright. Julian raised a beer bottle in a mock toast. To us and Aura Designs. I told you I'd make Harrington say yes. Zariah laughed, but his words pricked, a subtle claim to her victory. She pushed the thought aside, sketching late into the night, the sea glass glinting on Julian's cluttered desk, a beacon of their shared vow. The memory faded, and Zariah opened her eyes to the New York night. The sea glass was gone now, discarded like their promises, replaced by Julian's cold ambition. Her fingers tightened on the balcony railing, the metal biting into her palms. The Solstice Tower, rising in the distance, was her creation. Every curve, every line born from her hands, her heart. Yet Julian stood on its stage, claiming her soul as his own. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was a theft of her legacy, her truth. Inside the ballroom, Julian's voice carried, boasting of profits and power. Claudia Wentworth sipped her drink, her eyes narrowing as he spoke of his vision. Bold words for a man who didn't draw a single line, she murmured to a colleague, her tone laced with doubt. Edward Langston, still seated, traced the rim of his glass, his thoughts on Zariah's sketches from years ago, designs that had moved him, not Julian's slick pitches. The room buzzed with admiration for Croft, but cracks were forming, whispers of unease rippling through the elite. Zariah turned from the skyline, her shawl slipping to her shoulders. The gala's noise faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of her resolve. She wasn't the woman Julian had tried to erase. She was the architect who'd dreamed an empire, who'd turned glass into a vow. Her studio waited, filled with sketchbooks that held the truth. Pages Julian couldn't burn, lines he couldn't steal. Harrington's gift, that leather-bound book, still sat on her shelf, a reminder of who'd believed in her first. She stepped toward the corridor, her heels a quiet drumbeat. The Solstice Tower would be her reckoning, not his triumph. The sea glass might be lost, but its fire burned in her. Zariah Vance would not be silenced. Zariah Vance stepped away from the balcony, the New York skyline fading behind her, like a promise deferred. The echo of her resolve, sharp, unyielding, propelled her through the St. Regis corridor, her heels striking a rhythm against the marble. Julian's betrayal had carved a wound deeper than words, but it was the memory of their sea glass vow that burned hottest. She'd built Aura Designs with her hands, her heart, only to watch it slip into his grasp. As she descended the grand staircase, the gala's din receded, replaced by a montage of years that had eroded their dream, turning love into a lie. 3 years ago, Julian's transformation began. Success had crowned him, and he wore it like a king drunk on power. The Brooklyn studio was a distant memory, replaced by a Manhattan penthouse where mirrors reflected his ego. Boardroom meetings, once a dance of their shared vision, became his stage. Zariah, once the voice of Aura Design's soul, found herself sidelined, her sketches buried under Julian's polished presentations. "Trust me, darling," he'd say, his smile too bright. "I'm just packaging your ideas for the investors." But his words grew hollow, his gaze sliding past her to the next deal, the next conquest. He traded late-night brainstorming for yacht parties, where champagne flowed and models clung to his arm. Zariah, her dark eyes sharp with focus, pored over blueprints in their home office, refining the Solstice Tower's organic curves. Julian rarely noticed. He'd return at dawn, reeking of whiskey and perfume, tossing her a distracted kiss before collapsing into bed. Her protests were met with charm turned weapon. "You're the genius, Zariah, but I'm the face. Let me do what I do best." She swallowed her anger, believing their cornerstone still held. The shift became undeniable at a charity gala last spring, a glittering affair at the Met. Zariah, in a crimson gown that hugged her frame, stood beside Julian as he schmoozed. Kinsley Harper, a young influencer with sharp cheekbones and sharper ambition, glided into their orbit. Her blonde hair shimmered under the lights, her laugh a calculated melody. She brushed past Zariah, her clutch accidentally knocking a glass of Merlot onto Zariah's dress. "Oh, darling," Kinsley purred, her green eyes glinting. "You're used to cleaning up, aren't you?" The crowd tittered. Julian's laugh was loudest. Zariah's jaw tightened, her gaze locking with Kinsley's. A silent challenge met with a smirk. She excused herself, the stains spreading like blood across her chest, her dignity bruised but unbroken. Julian's betrayal deepened in the boardroom. He began presenting Zariah's organic architecture as his own, his voice weaving her philosophy into his narrative. Investors nodded, enthralled by his charisma, while Zariah sat at the table's end, her contributions erased. Claudia Wentworth, a shareholder with a hawk's gaze, noticed. "Zariah, your silence is deafening," she said once, her tone probing. Zariah forced a smile, her fingers tracing the leather sketchbook Harrington had given her years ago, its pages a testament to her truth. But she stayed quiet, her faith in Julian fraying like worn thread. The final cut came one gray afternoon in Julian's office, a glass and steel shrine to his ego. Zariah stopped by to discuss a design tweak, only to find an assistant clearing out old files. A cardboard box labeled junk sat open, filled with pens, crumpled receipts, and the cobalt sea glass, its glow dulled by neglect. Zariah's breath caught, her fingers trembling as she lifted it. The shard, once their cornerstone, lay discarded among refuse. On Julian's new marble desk sat a baccarat crystal orb, cold and flawless, a monument to his reinvention. She stood frozen, the glass cutting into her palm, not from sharpness, but from memory. Julian had erased their vow, erased her. She slipped the sea glass into her pocket, its weight a quiet accusation. The assistant, a young man with nervous eyes, stammered. "Mr. Croft said to clear out the old stuff." Zariah nodded, her face a mask. She left without a word, the shard a burning ember against her skin. That night, alone in her studio, she opened Harrington's sketchbook, its pages filled with the Solstice Tower's genesis. Her genesis. Each line screamed her truth, a truth Julian had stolen. Back in the present, Zariah reached the St. Regis lobby, the gala's noise a distant hum. Claudia Wentworth's voice echoed in her mind. "Architect turned housekeeper. What a waste." The scorn had stung, but it was Edward Langston's silent frown that lingered, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. They knew fragments of her story, but not enough to act. Not yet. Zariah's fingers brushed the sea glass in her pocket, its edges a map of her resolve. Julian thought he'd buried her in his shadow, but shadows only existed where light burned bright. She was that light, and she would sear through his lies. The city's pulse thrummed outside, a call to battle. Zariah stepped into the night, her breath visible in the cold. The Solstice Tower loomed in the distance, its steel skeleton her creation, her soul. Julian's empire was built on her bones, but bones could rise. She'd reclaim her legacy, not with screams, but with truth, sharp, unyielding, and hers alone. Zariah Vance stepped into the New York night, the city's chill biting her skin as the St. Regis faded behind her, the sea glass in her pocket pressed against her thigh, a silent pulse of betrayal and promise. Julian's empire, built on her stolen dreams, loomed in the distant skyline, its steel spires mocking her. But Zariah was no longer the woman who'd stood silent under his lies. The fire that had forged her sketches, her soul, burned brighter than ever. She hailed a cab, her breath a faint cloud in the air, and whispered to herself, "This empire was mine. It won't bury me." The words were a vow, etched in the same unyielding resolve that had shaped the Solstice Tower. In her Harlem apartment, the walls hummed with quiet defiance. Zariah's studio, a sanctuary of blueprints and memories, was alive with the ghosts of her designs. She flicked on a single lamp, its glow spilling over a cluttered desk where Harrington's leather-bound sketchbook lay, its embossed initials catching the light. She opened it, her fingers tracing the first sketch of the Solstice Tower, a flowing silhouette inspired by Big Sur's cliffs, each line a piece of her heart. Julian had taken credit for it, his voice drowning hers in boardrooms. But these pages were her truth, inked in midnight hours when hope still bound them. She sank into a chair, the sea glass now on the desk, its cobalt glow a beacon. The memory of Kinsley's taunt, used to cleaning, right? Stung, but it was Julian's discarded vow that cut deepest. Zariah's eyes narrowed, her mind racing. She wasn't a housekeeper, nor a shadow to be erased. She was the architect, the soul of Aura Designs, and she would reclaim her legacy. Her gaze fell on a stack of old emails, printed and annotated, proof of her designs sent to Julian in their early days. Each one was a brick in the wall she'd built against him. She opened her laptop, her fingers steady as she drafted a message to Mr. Harrington. The old investor, with his gruff voice and sharp eyes, had seen her potential first. "Your buildings are alive," he'd said, handing her that sketchbook a decade ago. Julian's betrayal hadn't reached him. Not yet. Zariah typed carefully, her words measured but urgent. "Mr. Harrington, I need to meet. The truth about the Solstice Tower must be told." She attached a single scan, a sketch from 2015 signed with her initials, undeniable proof. She hit send, her pulse quickening. Harrington was her first ally, a bridge to the past she'd reclaim. The phone buzzed an hour later. Harrington's reply brief. "Tomorrow 9 a.m., my office. Bring everything." Zariah exhaled, a weight shifting but not lifting. She gathered her sketchbooks, each page a weapon. The Solstice Tower's launch was days away, Julian's crowning moment. She'd make it her stage. She envisioned a video, her voice, her sketches, her truth, projected on the massive LED screen, shattering his lies before the world. Her fingers trembled with purpose as she sketched a new plan. Not of buildings, but of justice. The next morning, Harrington's office smelled of old leather and cigar smoke. He sat behind a mahogany desk, his silver hair catching the sunlight. "Zariah," he said, his voice rough but kind. "I suspected Julian was embellishing, but this—" He held up her sketch, its curves unmistakable. "This is yours. Why didn't you speak sooner?" Zariah's throat tightened. "I trusted him. I thought we were partners." Harrington's eyes softened, but his jaw set. "He's a thief. What do you need from me?" She laid out her plan. The video, the launch, the truth. Harrington nodded, his fingers tapping the desk. "I'll ensure the stage is yours, but be careful. Julian's desperate men are dangerous." Back in her studio, Zariah worked through the night. She recorded her voice, steady but fierce, narrating the tower's creation. "Every curve was born from Big Sur's cliffs, from a dream I held first." She layered in images of her sketches, emails, and even a photo of the sea glass on their old desk. The video was raw, unpolished, but its truth was a blade. She encrypted it, sent it to a trusted technician at the launch venue, a young woman who'd once admired Zariah's work. "Make sure it plays," Zariah whispered over the phone. The technician's voice was firm. "It will." Outside, the city thrummed, oblivious to the storm brewing. Julian, somewhere in his penthouse, likely toasted his triumph with Kinsley, unaware of the noose tightening. Zariah imagined his face at the launch, his smugness crumbling as her voice filled the room. Claudia Wentworth's words echoed, "Architect turned housekeeper. What a waste." But Claudia didn't know the half of it. Edward Langston's silent frown lingered too, a hint of doubt she'd turned to her advantage. The shareholders weren't all Julian's puppets. Some remembered her. Zariah stood, the sea glass in her hand, its weight a reminder of what she'd lost and what she'd reclaim. The Solstice Tower was hers, not just in steel, but in soul. Julian had built his empire on her truth, but truth was a fire that consumed lies. She slipped the glass into her pocket, her eyes fixed on the skyline. The launch was coming, and with it, her reckoning. She wasn't the woman who'd walked away from the gala. She was Zariah Vance, architect of empires, and her designs would speak louder than Julian's deceit. Zariah Vance stood in her studio, the sea glass glinting under the lamp's glow, a silent witness to her vow. The encrypted video, now sent to the technician, was a ticking bomb, poised to detonate at the Solstice Tower's launch. Her fingers brushed the leather sketchbook, its pages heavy with the truth Julian had stolen. The city outside her Harlem window thrummed, a restless pulse matching her own. She'd ignited a spark with Harrington's promise, but the fire of her plan needed one final test: Julian's nerve. As dawn crept over the skyline, a message from Julian buzzed her phone, curt and commanding. "Study, tonight, 8 p.m. We need to talk." Her lips curved, not in fear, but in anticipation. He'd sensed her moves. The game was on. That evening, Zariah stepped into the mansion's study, a fortress of mahogany and ambition. Julian sat behind a massive desk, his blonde hair catching the firelight, a portrait of himself looming overhead like a tyrant's shadow. The air was thick with the scent of leather and wax, the room a stage for his power. Papers were neatly stacked, but Zariah's sharp eyes caught a glimpse of a contract, Langston's name scrawled in Julian's hasty script. She filed the detail away, her pulse steady. Julian leaned back, his blue eyes cold, assessing. "You've been busy, Zariah," he said, his voice smooth but edged with menace. "Meeting Harrington behind my back? Not your smartest move." Zariah stood tall, her black sweater a stark contrast to the room's opulence. "Smarter than letting you erase me," she replied, her tone even but sharp. Julian's jaw twitched, a crack in his polished facade. He slid a folder across the desk, its leather cover embossed with his initials. "A settlement," he said, his smile ablaze. "The penthouse shares in 3 funds, 10 million in cash. Walk away quietly, Zariah. Take it, and you'll never scrub another floor." The jab was deliberate, echoing his gala humiliation. Her fingers tightened at her sides, the sea glass in her pocket a grounding weight. She stepped closer, her gaze locking with his. "You think money buys my soul, Julian? You sold yours years ago. I'm not for sale." Her voice was low, a steel thread woven with fire. Julian's smile faltered, his fingers drumming the desk. "Don't be naive," he snapped, leaning forward. "You push this, and people get hurt. Harrington's old, vulnerable. Your little studio? A bad lease could end it. And those sketches you cling to? They're nothing without my name." His threat hung heavy, a storm cloud in the room's dim light. Zariah's heart pounded, but her face remained a mask of defiance. "You're scared," she said, her voice cutting through his bluster. "I know about the Langston deal, Julian. Forged signatures, inflated numbers. You're not untouchable." His eyes widened, a flicker of panic betraying him before he masked it with a laugh. "You're grasping, darling. No one will believe you over me." But his hand trembled as he reached for a pen, betraying the crack in his armor. Zariah saw it, and her resolve hardened. She'd struck a nerve. The Langston contract, a secret she'd glimpsed in his emails months ago, was her leverage, a card she'd play when the time was right. She turned, her silhouette sharp against the firelight. "Keep your money, Julian. You'll need it when your empire falls." She paused at the door, glancing back. "I know every lie you've built, every brick you stole. Sleep well." His face darkened, but he said nothing, his silence a concession. Zariah left the study's weight lifting as she stepped into the hall, the sea glass pressed against her thigh, a reminder of her truth. Julian thought he could buy her silence, but he'd underestimated the woman who dreamed his empire into being. Outside, the city was a restless beast, its lights flickering like warning signals. Zariah walked to her car, her mind racing. Harrington's support was secured, the video ready, but Julian's threats lingered. He wasn't bluffing about his power. Harrington's health, her studio's lease, were real vulnerabilities. Yet she'd faced worse than his bluster. She thought of Claudia Wentworth's sharp gaze at the gala, her whispered doubt. Architect turned housekeeper? Claudia wasn't Julian's pawn, nor was Edward Langston, whose frown had hinted at unease. There were cracks in Julian's fortress, allies she might turn. In her apartment, Zariah checked her phone. A message from the technician confirmed. "Video's locked in. It'll play." She exhaled, her fingers brushing the sketchbook. The Solstice Tower's launch was tomorrow. Julian's moment of glory. She pictured him on stage, Kinsley at his side, oblivious to the storm she'd unleash. Her video would strip him bare, her sketches a mirror to his deceit. She closed her eyes, seeing the tower's curves, her curves rising against the sky. Julian had mistaken her silence for weakness, But silence was her weapon, honed and ready. Zaria stood, the sea glass in her hand, its cobalt heart glowing. The city outside roared, a challenge she'd answer. Julian's threats were a desperate man's gambit, but she was no longer his shadow. She was the architect, the fire, and tomorrow her truth would burn brighter than his lies. Zaria Vance stood in her Harlem apartment, the sea glass a cool weight in her palm, its cobalt heart pulsing with purpose. The Solstice Tower's launch loomed hours away, a glittering spectacle where Julian would claim her legacy as his own. Her video, now locked in the hands of a loyal technician, was a blade poised to carve through his lies. She slipped into a tailored black dress, its lines sharp as her resolve, and pinned her curls with a silver clasp. The mirror reflected a woman forged in fire, not the housekeeper Julian had mocked, but the architect who dreamed an empire. Her phone buzzed with a final confirmation. "System set. Videos is ready." Zaria exhaled, her breath steady. The city outside roared, a beast awaiting her truth. The launch venue, a sleek plaza beneath the tower's rising steel, thrummed with anticipation. Spotlights swept the night sky, their beams slicing through Manhattan's haze. Media crews jostled, cameras flashing like vultures circling. Shareholders, draped in couture, mingled with champagne flutes, their murmurs a tide of power and greed. Julian Croft stood on the elevated stage, his Tom Ford suit immaculate, his blonde hair gleaming under the lights. Beside him, Kinsley Harper preened, her emerald gown clinging to her like ambition made flesh. Her green eyes scanned the crowd, a queen claiming her court. "Zaria's probably scrubbing floors tonight," she whispered to Julian, loud enough for a nearby reporter to smirk. Julian's laugh was a sharp bark, his hand grazing her waist. "Let's focus on the future, darling." The crowd parted as Claudia Wentworth arrived, her silver hair a crown, her gaze cutting through the pomp. She nodded to Edward Langston, whose weathered face betrayed a flicker of unease. "Julian's riding high," Claudia murmured, her voice low. "But I remember Zaria's sketches. Something's off." Edward's fingers tightened on his cane, his silence heavy. He'd invested in aura designs for Zaria's vision, not Julian's swagger. A young executive nearby whispered, "Who's that woman with Croft? Not his wife." The question hung, unanswered, as the crowd's buzz grew fevered. Julian stepped to the podium, his smile a polished weapon. "Tonight," he declared, his voice booming through the speakers, "we unveil the Solstice Tower, a monument to my vision, my legacy." The crowd erupted, clapping like a trained choir. Kinsley beamed, her hand resting on his arm, a silent claim. Julian's eyes gleamed, drunk on adoration. "This tower," he continued, "is proof that dreams, when shaped by determination, redefine the world." His words were Zaria's, stolen from late-night talks in their Brooklyn studio, now twisted into his narrative. Claudia's lips thinned, her fingers tapping her clutch. "His vision," she muttered to a colleague. "Or hers." Behind the scenes, a young technician named Maya adjusted her headset, her hands steady, but her pulse racing. Zaria's video, uploaded and queued, was her secret mission. She'd met Zaria years ago, a mentor who'd inspired her to study engineering. "This is for you," Maya whispered, checking the system. A security guard glanced her way, his eyes narrowing, but Maya's smile disarmed him. Julian had tried to secure the event, even hiring extra techs to monitor the screens, but Zaria's plan had slipped through his net. Maya's fingers hovered over the controls, the clock ticking down. On stage, Julian raised a glass, his voice soaring. "To Aura Designs, to New York, to eternity." The crowd cheered, but cracks showed. Edward shifted, his gaze distant, as if seeing Zaria's old sketches in his mind. A reporter scribbled furiously, catching Claudia's murmured doubt. "Zaria Vance designed this tower. I'd bet my shares on it." A young investor nearby frowned, whispering, "Then why's Croft taking credit?" The question rippled, a quiet rebellion in the sea of applause. Kinsley, sensing the shift, leaned into Julian, her voice sharp. "Wrap it up, darling. They're restless." Julian ignored her, basking in the spotlight, oblivious to the storm brewing. Maya glanced at her watch. 10 seconds. The stage lights dimmed, a planned transition for Julian's closing flourish. The massive LED screen behind him flickered, its promotional loop of the tower's renderings fading to black. Julian paused, his smile tightening, sensing a glitch. The crowd murmured, confused. Maya pressed a key, her heart pounding. The screen blazed to life, not with Julian's logo, but with bold white text. The truth about the Solstice Tower. A collective gasp rose, heads turning. Julian's hand froze mid-gesture, his eyes darting to the control booth. Kinsley's grip on his arm tightened, her face paling. "What's this?" she hissed. The crowd stilled, eyes locked on the screen. Claudia's lips curved, a predator sensing blood. Edward leaned forward, his cane forgotten. The air crackled with anticipation, the city's pulse holding its breath. Zariah's truth was about to speak, and no one, not Julian, not Kinsley, could silence it now. The LED screen's bold text, "The truth about the Solstice Tower," hung like a guillotine over the plaza, silencing the crowd's murmurs. Spotlights froze, their beams pinning Julian Croft to the stage, his polished smile cracking like thin ice. Kinsley Harper's grip on his arm tightened, her emerald gown shimmering as she whispered, "Stop it, Julian." But the screen obeyed no one, its light searing the night. Zariah Vance's voice, steady and resonant, filled the air, each word a chisel breaking Julian's empire. "Every building has a soul," she began, her image fading in, a silhouette in her Harlem studio, the sea glass glinting beside her. The crowd leaned forward, shareholders' champagne forgotten, reporters' pens poised. Claudia Wentworth's eyes gleamed, a predator sensing prey. Edward Langston's cane stilled, his breath held. Zariah's video was a masterstroke, raw and unyielding. "The Solstice Tower was born from Big Sur's cliffs," she said, her dark eyes piercing the camera. Sketches flashed across the screen. Her sketches, signed with her initials, their curves echoing the ocean's rhythm. Emails followed, time stamped from a decade ago. Zariah's words to Julian outlining the tower's philosophy. "Organic architecture," she'd written, "is my heart, my truth." A photo appeared, the sea glass on their old Brooklyn desk, Julian's hand beside hers. The crowd gasped, a ripple of recognition. Claudia whispered to a colleague, "She's right. I knew it." A young investor muttered, "Croft stole it all." Julian's face drained of color, his hand fumbling for the podium's edge. On stage, Julian lunged for the microphone. "This is a lie," he shouted, his voice cracking, but the speakers betrayed him, amplifying Zariah's truth instead. "I dreamed this tower," she continued, her voice a tide pulling him under. "Julian sold my vision as his own, buried my name." The screen showed a final sketch, Zariah's signature bold in the corner, dated before Aura Design's first contract. Kinsley's eyes darted to the control booth, her voice shrill. "Turn it off," she hissed, shoving past Julian, but the technician, Maya, stood firm behind locked glass, her headset off, her loyalty to Zariah unbreakable. The crowd's mood shifted, a storm breaking. A reporter snapped photos, the flash blinding. Edward Langston stood, his cane tapping once, his voice low but clear. "She's telling the truth." A murmur of agreement swelled, shareholders exchanging glances. Claudia clapped slowly, her silver rings glinting, drawing others to join. Julian's eyes widened, his breath shallow. "No," he stammered. "She's nothing. Nobody." But his words drowned in the crowd's rising tide. Kinsley grabbed his sleeve, her face a mask of panic. "Do something," she pleaded. But Julian was a statue, his empire crumbling under Zariah's voice. The video ended, the screen fading to black. Silence gripped the plaza, heavy as stone. Then a spotlight sliced through the darkness, landing at the back of the crowd. Zariah Vance stood there, her black dress a blade of elegance, her posture unyielding. Her dark curls framed a face carved from resolve, her eyes locking on Julian across the sea of faces. She said nothing. Her presence was enough, a living testament to the truth. The crowd turned, gasps rippling like waves. A reporter whispered, "That's her," as cameras flashed, capturing Zariah's quiet power. Claudia's clap grew louder, joined by others, a thunder of vindication. Julian staggered, his hand clutching the podium. "Zariah!" he croaked, but his voice was a ghost, swallowed by the crowd's roar. Kinsley's face twisted, her eyes darting for an exit, but the spotlight held her too, exposing her complicity. She hissed at Julian. "You said she was nothing!" But he didn't hear, his gaze fixed on Zariah, the woman he'd tried to erase now standing taller than his tower. Edward Langston stepped forward, his voice cutting through. "Croft, you're done!" A shareholder shouted. "Explain yourself!" The plaza erupted, questions and accusations flying like arrows. Zariah remained still, her silence louder than the chaos. The sea glass, hidden in her pocket, was her anchor, its weight a reminder of the vow she'd kept. She'd built the Solstice Tower, not just in steel, but in truth, and now it stood as her monument. Julian's lies had crumbled, his empire exposed as a house of cards. Kinsley shoved through the crowd, her heels clattering, but no one followed. Her reign was over. Reporters swarmed, their questions aimed at Julian, who stood frozen, a king dethroned. Zariah turned, her silhouette sharp against the plaza's lights. She didn't need to speak. Her presence had spoken. The city's pulse beat around her, a rhythm of justice. The Solstice Tower loomed above, its curves hers, its soul reclaimed. She walked away, the crowd parting, their whispers a hymn to her truth. Julian's voice called after her, a desperate plea lost in the wind. Zariah didn't look back. Her legacy was hers again, and no one could steal it now. Zariah Vance walked away from the plaza, the echoes of the crowd's accusations fading behind her. The Solstice Tower loomed, its steel curves her creation, now reclaimed in truth. Her black dress caught the night breeze, her steps steady as the city's pulse thrummed around her. Julian's desperate plea, "Zariah," was a ghost swallowed by the wind. She didn't look back. The sea glass in her pocket pressed against her thigh, its cobalt heart a vow fulfilled. The spotlight of her truth had shattered his lies, leaving his empire in ruins. Reporters swarmed the stage she'd left behind, their cameras trained on a broken man. Zariah's silhouette vanished into the Manhattan night, her legacy no longer his to steal. 1 year later, the city had rewritten its story. Aura Designs was a husk, its stock plummeting after lawsuits exposed Julian's fraud. The Langston deal, with its forged signatures, had been Zariah's final card, played through a discreet tip to investigators. Headlines screamed of Julian's disgrace, his name a synonym for deceit. Kinsley Harper had fled New York, her social media silent, her influence erased like a bad dream. Zariah read the news with a quiet nod, her focus elsewhere. She'd filed for divorce the morning after the launch, severing Julian's last claim on her, the penthouse, the shares, his millions. She'd taken none of it. Her wealth was her truth, and it was enough. In Harlem, Vance architecture rose like a phoenix. Zariah's firm, a beacon for those who valued vision over greed, drew talent from across the city. Architects and engineers, once stifled under Julian's reign, flocked to her, their loyalty forged in admiration. Claudia Wentworth, her silver hair glinting in boardroom lights, had been the first investor, her faith in Zariah unshaken. "You were always the soul of this," she'd said, signing the check. Edward Langston followed, his cane tapping as he toured Zariah's studio. "I should have spoken up sooner," he admitted, his voice heavy. Zariah smiled, forgiving but unyielding. "You're here now." The Center for a Sustainable Future, her firm's first major project, was her new cornerstone. Its site sprawled across a Brooklyn lot where cranes hummed and steel beams gleamed under a late afternoon sun. Zariah stood at the edge, her hard hat tilted back, her boots dusted with earth. The air smelled of concrete and possibility, the skyline a canvas for her dreams. Her team moved around her, their voices a chorus of purpose. A young architect, inspired by Zariah's story, handed her a blueprint, her eyes bright. "This is yours," she said, echoing Harrington's words from a decade ago. Zariah nodded, her heart full. A letter from Harrington had arrived that morning, its handwriting shaky but warm. "You kept the truth alive," he wrote. "I'm proud. He was too frail to visit, but his words were a balm, a bridge to the past where her vision had first taken root. Zaria tucked the letter into her jacket, her gaze on the foundation trench before her. The concrete, freshly poured, glistened like a promise, its surface still soft. She knelt, her fingers brushing the warm mix, the earth's pulse beneath her. From her pocket, she drew the sea glass, its cobalt glow catching the sun. 10 years ago, she'd called it their cornerstone, a symbol of dreams shared with Julian. Now it was hers alone, a relic of her resilience. She pressed it into the concrete, its edges sinking into the wet gray, embedding her truth into the structure. "This is my legacy," she whispered, her voice soft but fierce. "No one can take it." The concrete would harden, sealing the glass forever, a heart within her creation. She stood, wiping her hands, her eyes tracing the site's skeleton. Cranes swung overhead, their cables singing in the breeze. Her team watched, their respect a quiet tide. The young architect stepped closer, her voice low. "They're calling you the soul of New York's skyline." Zariah's lips curved, not in a smile but in something deeper, certainty. She didn't need Julian's empire, his mirrors, his lies. She'd built her own, brick by brick, truth by truth. The skyline stretched before her, its jagged peaks no longer a crown of betrayal, but a challenge met. The Solstice Tower stood in the distance, its curves hers, its story rewritten. Julian was a shadow now, his name faded, his power broken. Zariah's legacy was rising, not in headlines but in steel and stone, in the work of her hands. She turned to her team, her voice clear. "Let's build." They nodded, tools in hand, ready to shape her vision. As the sun dipped, casting gold across the site, Zariah walked the perimeter, her boots steady on the earth. The sea glass, now part of the foundation, was her vow made real, a legacy unstealable, a future hers alone. New York's pulse beat with her own, a rhythm of triumph. She was Zariah Vance, architect of dreams, and her story was just beginning. Zariah Vance's triumph echoes beyond the skyline, her sea glass legacy etched in steel and truth. Her journey from betrayal's shadow to architect of her destiny leaves a mark on New York's heart. What did her story stir in you? Was it her unyielding resolve, Julian's fall, or the quiet power of truth that gripped you most? Listeners are invited to share their thoughts, their city, and the time they join this tale, connecting across the world to celebrate Zariah's victory. Gratitude flows to each who walked this path, captivated by her fire. The city's pulse beats on, and more stories await, ready to ignite your imagination. Return soon for another saga of dreams and defiance, where truth always finds its voice.